Hey guys, it's Eric here, and I'm back with another episode of the Engaging with Eric podcast. In this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Sheena Mason. Dr. Mason is an assistant professor of English at SUNY Oneonta and the founder of the Theory of Racelessness. The Theory of Racelessness posits the belief that racism masquerades as race in society, that race is artificial and does not in fact exist, and that the best way to tackle racism is by eliminating race, as what we imagine as race is actually racism, and resorting to racial language amplifies racism. In the video, we discuss her theory in depth, the emotional appeal of racialized language, the dangers of stereotyping, differences between Ireland and the US and how race is perceived, the best ways to go about defining racism, and lots more. The conversation was incredibly eye-opening, and I definitely took away a lot from it, and I sincerely hope you do too. Before getting into the episode, I'd like to extend a word of thanks to the founder of Gore Media, Momobo Ogoro, for introducing me to the work of Dr. Mason. Without further ado, here's the video. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Engaging with Eric podcast. And today I am joined with a very special guest, Dr. Sheena Mason, the founder of the Theory of Racelessness. Thanks so much.
Hi, Eric. Hi, thank you for having me. I'm happy to talk with you today.
No worries. Thanks so much for joining me today. Your theory is very unique, and I think increasingly, ever more, I'm seeing more and more commentary on your theory, more and more of your contributions in writing and generally speaking. So I think coming from Ireland, a country where racial dialogue is only really beginning, it's in its kind of opening stages. I think having different insights and alternative ways of thinking about race and introducing it to the public is incredibly important. So your theory, I think, could really have an impact in how we think about all of these things. So I guess I first want to ask you, what is the theory of racelessness and what does it advocate for?
So the theory of racelessness operates from two uncommon philosophical positions on race. There are 6 philosophies of race, and there's an entire specialization within the discipline of philosophy where philosophers study this thing called philosophy of race. And of the 6 philosophies, each person holds 2 of those philosophies, even without having the proper name for it. And I find that in most societies, especially in the American context, there are 2 philosophical positions that people are really defaulted to participate and subscribe to because of the fact that we're not taught these other alternative ways to view the same thing. The philosophies of race include something called naturalism. If you're a naturalist, you believe that race is biological. There's something called constructionism. If you're a constructionist, you believe that race may not be biological, but it's somehow manifested in real ways as a social construction. Where I sit is something called skepticism. As a skeptic, I argue that race is neither natural, so it's not biological, nor is it socially constructed. The thing people point to and say this is race or racial, we're misnaming other actual things, right? Like we're misnaming racism, which camouflages itself as race, or we're misnaming ethnicity or culture. So my theory of racelessness helps people disentangle all of those things to become more clear-eyed about what racism is and what it isn't. And the second meaning of racelessness speaks to the second philosophical position that I hold. In American society, we're taught to be something called conservationists, which would be to maintain or keep the category of race. Usually, if you're a conservationist, you're a naturalist, right? Because you can't defy nature in theory. Also, there's something called Reconstructionism. This is the most common philosophical position in the States where for whatever reason, you're trying to reconstruct how race operates in society and what people think of race. This has been the position for centuries. Reconstructionists are generally constructionists. And my philosophical position is eliminativism. So as a skeptical eliminativist, I argue that, okay, most people believe in the unicorn of race. And in that way, racelessness is an aspiration. To undo racism, we have to undo race. There's something to be eliminated, right? So racelessness speaks to my skepticism and my eliminativism. But I will say that one needn't be a skeptic to be an eliminativist. My mentor, Jacoby Carter at Howard University, is a constructionist eliminativist. So he operates from within the category while seeking its destruction. But I think for the average person, that's a very difficult and tenuous position to hold. So I teach as many people about skepticism as I possibly can.
Fantastic. And I'll definitely be coming back to the theory specifically to talk about the metaphysical aspects of it that I think I side with, but also the normative ones too. But I guess my next question is, was it difficult for you to come to the conclusions, the theoretical conclusions that you've come to, considering the fact that I think the cultural environment today in regards to anti-racism, especially in this day and age right now, is one that is predominantly dominated by the likes of the Robin DiAngelos and the Ibram X. Kendis, who conceptualize anti-racism in a very specific way. And if I recall correctly, upon reading part of your dissertation, I remember reading how you talked about how aspects of African-American literature tend to take a very hyper-racial focus too. But there are also hidden voices within the literature that are not necessarily highlighted as much as you feel like they should be. So you being a kind of version of those hidden figures in today's time, and that you're somewhat heretical in what you're doing in an American context, at least, did you find it hard to come to the position that you have, theoretically speaking?
Yeah, because something that I don't talk a lot about, because people tend to try to focus on the logical claims that I make as best they can, is the emotional labor that went into my own intellectual journey. Because initially, when I started having more language, specifically the first way that I framed what I now call my theory of racelessness, it was in the words, to undo racism, we must undo race. That's what I felt like the literature was showing me, and my examination of literary studies and the production of race, and particularly Blackness in the States. When I had those words, I hit the brakes almost instantly. I was like, this is not, I spent time in my mentor's office talking about how, even though my knowledge was telling me a particular thing, I felt an affinity toward what was my race, my Blackness. I put everything positive about myself into the category of Blackness. And as such, it was hard for me to concede the point that to undo racism, I must undo these things that I was subscribing to my Blackness. And it was a very emotional thing for me. For a while, I was a constructionist eliminativist. So that's kind of how I got around not calling myself Black, for example, and being a hypocrite, and not calling other people Black or white or whatever. But as I kept doing research and I kept going down this path, and as much as I emotionally kind of wanted to resist, I also knew that I was onto something and that I was right, and I couldn't unknow what I knew. So I kept going down the path, and then I found myself a skeptic. And that's when I was able to disconnect the emotional work, the emotional aspect of it fully in my mind, and liberate myself from the thing altogether. But it was a journey. It was a path.
Okay, really, really fascinating. And again, I really want to get into the theory soon, logically speaking, in regards to what I take from it, personally speaking, the positions I take predicated on the theory. But next, I want to talk to you about something that I think is really lacking. Of course, I come from Ireland, so when I'm viewing the racial discourse in America, I do it from an outsider's perspective. But I think what's really lacking in the popular intellectual discourse about race and it's lacking because I think that the discourse is being minimized to a political level and not appreciating the magnitude of how people think and talk about race generally. And what's lacking, I think, is an acknowledgement of the emotional appeal of racial ways of thinking. Firstly, like speaking for myself, when I was younger, like I come from a Pan-Africanist household, so I'm of Nigerian descent, but my mom was a big Pan-Africanist. So I remember when I was younger, I'd come back from school and I might tell her that I faced racism in school or discrimination. And she'd sit me down at age 10, 11, and she put on like a 40-minute Malcolm X speech. And at the time, it's like, Mom, I don't think this is helping me, because it was so laborious for me to watch this at 11. But after a while, of course, I steeped and immersed myself too in Pan-African literature, but also figures such as Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey and the like. And I don't think words can explain what watching Malcolm X say something like, who taught you to hate the color of your skin, Who taught you to hate yourself from the top of your head to the soles of your feet? Who taught you to hate the texture of your hair? Who taught you to hate your own kind? We teach you to love who you are, to love the fact that you're Black and you're beautiful. You know, facing discrimination and racism, and then coming home to such a charismatic figure, as many kind of activists within the realm of race were speaking to you in such a manner, does not invoke the kind of political assumptions people are making about wokeism and academic interpretations of race that people are speaking to, but it's a deeply emotional thing that it brings from you, and it invokes from you. And when I hear people talk about race and attach themselves to race, people who are Black, in my case, they do it for this reason, because they've been revealed to figures that have allowed them to love themselves, to engage in a kind of cognitive opening to the idea that they might be beautiful despite what they hear about themselves in a racial context. And secondly, I think also, like in relativistic historical terms, the end of colonialism was like yesterday, and the end of segregation in the USA was like yesterday, like in a historical context. And I think the backlash and reaction from that, from many people who were racially the victims within those periods of time, is a deeply racial one. And I think in a human context, it's somewhat understandable. Doesn't make it logically correct per se in light of the theory, but it's somewhat understandable. And I don't think people hold space for how close in time the end of colonialism and segregation is, but also the emotional appeal of racial ways of thinking when you've been revealed to a racial argument that empowers you rather than disempowers you. So I'd love to know your take on my points here.
Yeah, so that connects a bit with how I responded to the last question, because that's why I resisted my own ideas for a long time, because I had the emotional pull of celebrating and elevating and honoring what I called my Blackness. And it took a long time to recognize that what I was recognizing about myself wasn't race. It wasn't racial. It was unique to me and my being, and, you know, my resiliency and my tenacity and my determination and my motivation and my intellect and my kindness and my warmth and all of that. It's not, race doesn't produce those qualities and characteristics, right? There's nothing positive about being racialized, in fact. And so although it's logical how race has been constructed and then reconstructed to have a practical utility, there's a difference between something being beneficial and something being of utility. And I think for racialized Black people, especially in the States, racializing oneself and embracing one's race and making race such that it is speaking to something metaphysical and it's sort of it encompasses almost everything, has had practical utility. But there must come a time when we recognize that although it has practical utility, our upholding of the same category and the same idea, the same language, is also having the unintentional effect of upholding racism itself. Because to my mind and my analysis, racism is race. It's the same thing. And we can tell ourselves that's not true, right? And we can put our feet down and dig our heels into the ground and try to resist that awareness, but it is true. And so the only thing that I'm advocating for through my theory of racelessness work and educating people is the disentangling of all of the things that have been repurposed and packaged as race or perceived as racial, so that the only thing one lets go of and liberates oneself from is the violence of racism and what I call racialist ideology. Everything else that we love and celebrate about ourselves remains, because I'm not talking about eliminating that. It's more a matter of reframing it in your head to recognize it's not racial. We might want it to be because it makes us feel good, but that doesn't mean that it is, right? And even Malcolm X, I love that you bring him up, because even Malcolm X comes to be a skeptical eliminativist at the end of his life. And if you read his autobiography very closely by Alex Haley, you see that skepticism, eliminativism after, I think it was after he goes on to Mecca, he starts to completely shift his own conception of what racism is, and his language shifts with it. And I think it's no coincidence that that's when he's assassinated.
Absolutely. And I do hope to get into what I think was, firstly, I have to say that with Malcolm X and with King, I think an ironic thing today is that both names are utilized quite frequently, but I think in really disingenuous context. I think if you're going to take from Malcolm X, you have to appreciate him at his most developed point, and the same applies to King. And I think you're right. I think that there was a strategic angle to the fact, interpreted by, let's say, those who assassinated him, to the fact that he took more of a transcendental, unifying way of seeing things after his trip from Mecca. And he also shifted when he found truth, like you did, it seems, in your journey too. So I want to ask you a bit about the dangers, in your opinion, of racialized thinking, like hyper deeply racialized thinking, because to me, because I hope to share my perspectives later, I think deeply racialized thinking and ways of behaving sometimes can construct a rigid sort of space that can be quite trapping. You know, Obama, in a speech I think he gave at the DNC in 2004, he talked about how he hoped for America to one day be a place where a Black boy reading a book isn't told that he's acting white. Another example is recently, I don't know if you saw what happened with Jessie Nelson. She's a member of the Girls
Oh,
Band
yes.
Vision.
She was accused of blackfishing and all of that.
Right. And look, people said, in the case of cultural appropriation, people said that she was appropriating quote unquote Black culture because she wore streetwear. And I'm of Nigerian descent, and streetwear is not.
Sorry.
I don't, yeah, it's not really my culture. Like, there's billions of Black people in the world. Like, are you sure you have a democratic consensus to make such a claim? Is what I was thinking. And also, too, in terms of racial ways of thinking, I think sometimes it doesn't have utility. For example, I'm completely against the idea of Black on Black crime. It's like what do you prescriptively take from that description? Black on Black crime. I think any criminologist would tell you that a better common denominator to draw when you look at crime is poverty. The same applies to people who talk about quote unquote Black people selling Black people into slavery. Like, maybe that's not the best common denominator to draw if you want to gain a better understanding of the dynamics of slavery. They obviously didn't see, there was no such thing as Black solidarity in the continent of Africa prior to racial interactions that took place thereafter. So I want to ask you about what you think the dangers are to racialized ways of thinking. I know you've kind of expressed it already, but how have you seen it manifest itself in the USA in your personal experience?
Yeah, so I've studied the genealogy of the word race, right? And come to find that the word race was initially used as a sort of caste system in early modern European societies. It typically spoke to something like nationality, sometimes ethnicity, and more often than not, it correlated with class. So it's no surprise that in the American context, they take the same word and they just repurpose it for their own nefarious purposes, namely to try to justify the enslavement of human beings, right? So from the beginning, ostensibly the beginning, of race ideology or racialist ideology in the context of the US, the word Black, of course, had already existed, but it gets repackaged to describe human beings, and it gets repackaged to describe human beings outside of human, right? Because they were considered property, they're considered beasts, they're considered animals, chattel. And it is that writing and rewriting of Blackness as race that people like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs then took because it was applied to them. So they adopted it as their part of the society and what was becoming the new American culture. And they tried to write humanity back into the word Blackness. And I say back, but really it was never there to begin with, at least in the US. And so they try to write humanity into what it is to be Black or racialized as Black. And with, I guess, a modicum of success, because then emancipation happens. And then you have Reconstruction and you have Jim Crow and then you have civil rights. So it's this constant and persistent effort to redefine and reclaim the word Black and the idea of Blackness as it pertains to race, to insert humanity into said Blackness. And that ultimately, to me, is part of the nefarious effect of adopting or privileging or promoting or teaching race ideology, because race is the hierarchy. it has always been a hierarchy of sorts, but in the American context, it became a hierarchy based primarily on phenotype and ancestry and all of these different things. And it spoke to a person's position in society. And it often mirrored a person's position in society, because if you were racialized as Black, then you were not always, because there were definitely free Africans here, free people of African descent in the United States, but more often than not, if you were racialized as Black, you were enslaved, because those free Africans weren't coded as Black in legal literature because they were free. So they were of color. It was different. And the idea that we can keep that language and repurpose it or repackage it and achieve the sort of liberation that I think most people aspire to is misguided, because it was never created to do that kind of work. And part of maintaining the category or specifically the language means that the inhumanity that's written into the category persists today, and the power or the imbalance of power persists today in the idea of what it is to be Black and what it is to be white. As you said, to be white or to sound white, to talk white or to act white, it's what's really coded in there is to have access to proper higher education, right? And if you think about it, you're like, okay, that idea makes sense because enslaved people weren't taught or they weren't allowed to read, right? So it's coded in there. So the ideas are actually logical and track with the history. But now we have, in 2021, people still holding onto those ideas because they're holding onto race, and the hierarchy is race. So I define racism as, simply put, the belief in race, the belief in race as in nature or as a construction, because race is the hierarchy, and that hierarchy washes over actual differences. It homogenizes people who are racialized into the same group. As you said, racialized Black people, we don't share the same culture. We don't even share the same culture in the same country. I don't know how it is in Ireland, but I imagine it's the same or very similar. In the States, culture is more regional, right? A so-called Black person in New York is very different from a so-called Black person in California, for example. But the word Black makes it seem like, oh, we're all the same. And the expectations and demands that are placed on people for being racialized a particular way continue to be nefarious. You know, this expectation of being impoverished, or the expectation of being uneducated, or the expectation of being more criminal, it's all bad. None of it is good. There's nothing positive about being racialized as Black in this country. And then the last thing I wanted to say too is the idea of Black on Black crime, right? So in the US, the left will say things like, Black people are more violent. We're more criminal because poverty, and we're more impoverished because systemic racism. People on the right will say Black people are more violent because their culture is inferior, right? Because to be, Black people celebrate not being educated and all of the things that we were just talking about. No, very infrequently do people say or ask the question, are Black people more criminal or more violent? And if we actually look at the statistics in an unbiased way, we come to find that not only are racialized Black people not as impoverished as the media would have us believe, statistically speaking, but we're also not this insanely violent group. You're talking about 2.5% of racialized Black people, 2.5% of 40 plus million, okay? Commit violent crimes. That is a minuscule number, but you would never guess it. Same thing with the idea of police hunting Black people in this country. It's like we have racialist ideology makes racism seem like it's this omnipresent, Black people need to fear for their lives. They have to fear each other, or they have to fear the cops. It's that, to me, is what inspires my work. In the first place, it was my sincere love for people racialized as Black and my desire to understand intergroup dynamics and fractures, and more importantly, my desire to be a solution maker and a problem solver, as opposed to just, lamenting over the problems that I was seeing, right? And I think that's how racism works, because and that's not something that gets addressed, I think, even at all, because if we talk about the emotional aspect of this, the psychological aspect of it, there's a way in which these narratives, these racialist narratives, have the effect of the racism that people proclaim exist and persist, that don't bear out in statistics and actual reality anymore. But it's the belief in that violence of racism that hurts people and hurts communities and gets passed on from generation to generation to generation. And it's that theory of racelessness can help people emancipate themselves from. Because it's one thing to have those ideas or have those feelings and it's true. And it's quite another thing to have those ideas and feelings and it's not really tracking with reality.
Wow. Lots of food for thought there. Okay, this sort of ties into a lot of what you said there, but it also allows me to articulate what my position is in regards to the theory, but generally speaking, how I approach race in Ireland, but generally. So I would say that, I'm an eliminativist to a great extent, but I'm also somewhat of a Reconstructionist, and for pragmatic reasons, I would say. Partly because of the personal anecdotal experience I articulated of me experiencing racism in school and coming home to watch a Malcolm X speech. I've met young people who have shared similar experiences and whom I've had to empower to let them know that they are beautiful and capable, but also because my approach is deeply inspired by the likes of Martin Luther King Jr., him especially, who I think is ironically so overlooked in the United States of America today. I don't hear King a lot, and I hear him being implicitly rejected by the likes of D'Angelo. I read her White Fragility book last year, and I wasn't very impressed, but she mentioned King earlier on to talk about how he should not be used as a pawn to make particular points. But then later in the book went to reject a lot of what King stands for without actually mentioning his name, which I think says a lot. But King, in one of my most favorite speeches of his, he talked about how if you look at the dictionary at the word black, you'll see something negative and ugly and low. But if you look at the word white, it's always something high and celestial and good. And he said, I want to get the language right today. And I want to let you know that you say to them, no, black is beautiful. He said, black and you're proud of it. But also, King held on to what I like to call the transcendental ideal, the North Star that we should all aim to aspire towards in the context of race, but also coming from Nigeria in the context of tribalism, which deeply divides the country to a great extent. And you can apply this deep transcendental ideal to any group context that we engage in as primates, which is what we fundamentally are. In Northern Ireland, here in Ireland, there was sectarian conflict, and there was a man called John Hume who was inspired by King, who talked about how we have to appreciate how we're all a part of one Irish family, and we have to work towards reconciliation and peace. King embodied this in a racial context. So he upheld the idea that America should strive to get to a place where the sons of former slaves and former slave owners can sit together in the table of brotherhood, where we can appreciate each other for the content of our character, not the color of our skin. But he also held space for a somewhat Reconstructionist message because he felt the need to empower his community. And in his book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, I recall him renouncing, let's say, an extremist group like the Nation of Islam, but also acknowledging how the work they were doing to rehabilitate a lot of Black Americans and to also try and empower them is something that people need to co-opt whilst rejecting their conclusion. So for me, I'm somewhat of a Reconstructionist in the sense that in Ireland, like, I think we're still, the Black community here in Ireland sometimes have been excluded from the idea of being Irish, and many migrant communities, because the integration process was like yesterday in relative terms, and we're still working to embrace different cultures and ethnicities and backgrounds. And I myself have struggled to find myself in the rubric of Irishness. So I try to empower members of my community to let them know that despite the racism you face, you are still to be proud of yourself. And the culture that comes with Blackness in Ireland it's not similar to America. It's more descriptive. Like people are deeply ethnically African or Caribbean here, so there are shared customs. And Ireland is a population of 5 million people anyway, so the Black people here tend to be of African descent or Caribbean descent. So the custom is shared, the cultures are similar. So I encourage people to embrace this culture and be proud of yourself, but also to aspire towards that transcendental North Star, our own version, which sees us wanting to be in a place where we can all cooperate. And I feel for this to be successful, like similar to how King kind of co-opted this method, I think a dual approach of Reconstructionism and eliminativism is necessary, in my opinion. And I think in America, considering the theory of racelessness, why would you oppose this approach? If someone said to you that, well, I feel we need to reconstruct what it means to be Black, or at least to acknowledge the other side of Blackness, figures like Booker T. Washington and Frederick Douglass, who stood up despite the odds and did what they did, to the civil rights tradition, who stood for love in the face of hatred. This apparent definition of Black that defies the hegemonic hierarchy that you spoke to. If someone says, I want to embrace this, but also advocate for eliminativism, what would you say to them?
So this is a critical point because many of my students ultimately end up seeing eliminativism as requiring reconstruction, because to undo a thing, you have to really unlearn and like reconstruct how people see a thing or how they see language or see history in order to actually successfully undo it. So I don't view Reconstructionism and eliminativism as being completely separate and distinct, except Reconstructionists ultimately are conservationists. Eliminativists are like, okay, let's reconstruct this thing into oblivion. And to me, that's the important distinction between the two. But I say that to say, I think people can easily, such as Elaine Locke, be a partial Reconstructionist, partial eliminativist. And I think that people can change their philosophies across time. As we were saying, Malcolm X did across his lifetime. He changed philosophies. And so I would say it's probably not going to be long before you become a full eliminativist. Just kidding. So something that's interesting about Douglass that I don't hear many people, if anyone, talking about, is the fact that, and this is part of what comes up for me through my dissertation turned book, with some very significant differences between the book and dissertation, of course, because a dissertation is just that, it's a dissertation. In Douglass's autobiography, in the first paragraph, I want to say, he says, my father is a white man. And it's not accidental, okay? He's going along with the one-drop rule, just like the vast majority of people in the American context who go along with the one-drop rule. But a deep part of my skepticism also comes from the recognition that if we buy into this idea of race, and my cat's moving around in the background, if we buy into this idea of race and all, it's still not what we think it is, because most people aren't going to look at Frederick Douglass and call him white. They're probably going to call him Black, but even then it's complicated, because I have a friend in Nigeria who says that if you or I went to Nigeria, maybe for you it'd be different because you're of Nigerian descent. But if me or somebody who looked like you, who wasn't from Nigeria, of Nigerian descent, went to there, we would be considered white, because anyone who's coming from overseas to the continent of Africa from a Nigerian concept of race is white. And so Asian people, all of that, like it's really interesting how the concept of race collapses in other countries and other spaces. Especially interesting to consider how this is true in countries in Africa, because Africa is often viewed from the American mindset as the birthplace of Black people. But then if you talk to so-called Black people from the continent, they have like their views of race and racism, it doesn't travel, right? Or if and where it exists, it's more of a matter of fact. It's just a like, well, obviously I'm Black because look at me, or obviously you're white because look at you, but it's not anything else. It's just a descriptor. I don't think we can get just to a sort of descriptor place, as you were saying earlier, where people don't always insert some type of meaning, for better for worse, into the race concept, primarily for reasons I've laid out, which is that race as a concept has always carried with it a caste practice or caste system. It is the hierarchy. And so it's, to me, it's like suggesting that we should reconstruct racism. Because if race is racism, then what I hear when people say, like, well, what about Reconstruction or whatever? No, because then you're telling me I should reconstruct racism. And I just don't think, from my own morality and ethical standpoint, that's not it. I'm not going to sit here and try to continue to reconstruct racism, which is what has been done in the context of the US. I think we really need to dispel, if we're, to the extent that eliminativism requires some amount of reconstruction, the goal needs to be to put it into obscurity and oblivion. And then the other thing I'll say that really stands out is this idea of Irishness. In the American context, because of our history here, it's true that the word American and the idea of American and America as a nation was originally founded and created and written for white people, so-called white people, and especially white men. And so after emancipation, you start to have all of these people putting hyphens toward American, right? It's African American, or it's Black American, Asian American, Italian American, Chinese, and all of that, or white American, or just American, which is understood as automatically signifying whiteness. And I think part of my work is helping people embrace their Americanness and helping them recognize their Americanness, because as a descendant of American slaves myself, which that's not true for all racialized Black people in this country, but I'm one of that population. I know that my ancestors lived, fought, died, all the things to be American, full stop. They weren't trying to be hyphenated American. They saw themselves as American, and they were fighting for that recognition. So I think that part of the healing work that ultimately can happen for us in the States is to embrace our Americanness and to recognize it, and to recognize how, because culture forms in the ways that it does, I tend to be aligned with thinkers like Edward Glissant, Derek Walcott, Kamau Brathwaite, these people who recognize that cultural formation is multi-directional, that in the context of the quote unquote new world, new cultures were created just as new nations were created. And in that new formation, I think it's foolish and upholds racism to try to distinctly separate and segregate how we view American culture across racialist lines. I think it's a fool's errand, because it upholds racism even without people intending it. And I also think that we can recognize American as ethnicity, which means we can recognize it as a culture, and we can see the complexity of culture and stop thinking about it in segregationist terms that don't actually help any of us. But also the removal of the race idea from it, or the race language, would also result in a proliferated understanding of ethnicity even outside of Americanness. And the proliferated understanding of what culture is outside of these things as well, because, you have people like Zora Neale Hurston who would argue that she's upheld as the mother of Black letters or Black culture, but toward the end of her life, it's always toward the end of somebody's life, when she writes Seraph on the Sewanee and has a hard time getting it published because the protagonist is a racialized white girl, people were slinging arrows at her, but she was like, you guys are recognizing this as Black, but I just see it as regional. I just see this as Southern dialect, not Black dialect. A Southern man, white or Black, sounds the same, according to Hurston, right? And I tend to be aligned with that kind of thinking. And I think that we're precluded from really seeing those similarities and that sharedness, the shared Americanness, because we keep trying to put people in the category of Black and white.
Fascinating. Fascinating. In the context of Ireland, just drawing upon some of your last points, I think I definitely agree with you to a great extent. I think what I'd advocate for, let's say, is an appreciation for the different ways that Irishness can be culturally manifested. So my Irish nature, I come from a town called Longford, and I'm very proud to come from that town, but at the same time, I'm of Nigerian descent. So I'll speak with an accent to some extent, but at the same time, I might speak with my Nigerian accent and eat Nigerian food. Yet I still proudly call myself Irish. And I think we're still adapting to this idea and concept. So when I say I'm a Reconstructionist, it's to the extent that I think empowerment is needed for those who can sometimes feel ostracized from the rubric of Irishness. And also, education is needed for those who sometimes can embrace the fact that there are different cultural embodiments of Irishness in modern Ireland. But a critical question I need to ask you that I think I can't believe that I haven't asked you yet is how the theory of racelessness approaches racism. Like, you know, the only way I know how to approach racism is by acknowledging race. Now, a caveat must be stated that the transcendental North Star that I articulated is what I think I'm attempting to strive towards. And I am on my own intellectual journey right now, trying to deeply understand racism. A few months ago, I did a course in evolutionary biology to learn a bit about how racial differences manifest in the wild, the MC1R mutation in, you know, leopards, for example, such a minuscule difference. I'm thinking about how we are primates fundamentally and how immigration from Africa is what created race, which is, again, such a negligible thing that has had such huge social implications. I think getting to the root of racial understanding can sometimes help you appreciate how negligible of a difference it is. But I think there's also room to appreciate the colossal impact that racial ways of thinking and the hierarchy of race has had. And the only way I feel like I can acknowledge that impact is by acknowledging and naming race. So how does the theory of racelessness approach race independent of race by not naming it or using that type of language?
Yeah, so this is a question I get often because I think sometimes people misunderstand. I think intuitively they see the sort of aspirational aspect of it, but then they sort of conflate the aspirational aspect of it with what I'm suggesting needs to happen here and now. And then I think that's where people can get tripped up. So I approach it from, number one, I teach people the philosophies of race. There's that. And then I encourage and invite people to step into the space as a skeptic, meaning as a raceless human being. And from this deracialized space, let's do what my friend calls race translating. Let's look at race language that comes up in media. Let's look at it through literature. Let's look at it from a historical analysis and a contemporary analysis to figure out what race is doing at any given point in time, but as a raceless human being. And part of this deracialization then encourages and inspires people to be more clear-eyed. Hear me when I say more logical, because they're more clear-eyed about what racism is and what it isn't, in ways that demanding people see themselves as racialized precludes more often than not. There's a way in which people who come into my workshops or trainings or my college students, when they're coming from a racialized perspective, things like proclamations of whiteness have happened, right? To say, what I'm going to say as a white person, it doesn't matter, or it matters less compared to you over there, you Black and colored students. And I'm like mortified, like, what is this? And then, mind you, has nothing to do with what we're talking about. So then I'm really confused. It's like, whereas the constructionists, reconstructionists, such as Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo, whom you mentioned earlier, would encourage those kinds of assertions and would encourage and actually require people to racialize themselves, see themselves as racialized, and then try to talk about racism. One can understand, I think, if we're using common sense, why that would be even more unnecessarily uncomfortable for everyone involved, right? It's not that discomfort is a inherently bad thing, but I think what's bad about the approach, or what's I'll say undesirable about the approach from my perspective, is that in forcing people into racialized boxes, we are then teaching racism and upholding racism. And we're upholding racist ideas, and we're not really able to get at the core of what racism is, how it operates, what it isn't, right? And for all of those reasons, encouraging people to recognize and embrace their own racelessness becomes a critical part of the work, because it really does encourage people to participate more freely. If they feel like they are not being seen in the class as a so-called white person, then they're going to feel freer to say what they think and ask questions in ways that, as a so-called white person, they are less likely to do sometimes, because they fear being wrong, they fear being pinned or pegged as a racist, right? And so it's like, if that's the culture that Kendi and D'Angelo are trying to create, or people who follow that line of thinking are trying to create, then they're doing a great job at ostracizing people and creating an environment in which people can't question things, right? But Theory of Racelessness works to inspire and empower people to really be able to question things. And it's through this questioning and this freedom from racism, the belief in race, that we're able to better name what racism is, which means we can better solve it. Because part of the problem too of working from within the category is that because we're not clear-eyed about it, we keep looking at symptoms. Race is a symptom of racism. It's a manifestation of racism. And we're talking about the symptom incessantly, and we're not talking about the root cause. And more often than not, you can treat the symptom, but you can't treat the root cause. And we have to treat the root cause of racism, which is really the belief that human beings are broken up into these categories that have any validity outside of, quite simply, how a person looks. And even how a person looks doesn't tell you what race they are, right? And I would point to Walter White for any listeners out there. Look up Walter White, Charles Chestnut, Jean Toomer. Those are really prime examples of how race doesn't operate in the neat and tidy ways that we would demand of it. And if that's the case, then what is the validity? Like, why are we, you know what I'm saying? Like, why are we holding on to it?
Okay. I guess my next question, it's a two-pronged question. It draws on sort of some of what you said previously in regards to the way that some white people in a class that you might host may behave, but also what we said so far about approaching racism in a raceless way, or in a racial way, but of course, in your case, in a raceless way. How would the theory of racelessness, how would you define racism? And also, how would you perceive the term privilege? Because, you know, when it comes to racism, for instance, the popular belief now, and I think this is greatly influenced by critical race theory. I may be wrong, but from the texts that I've read thus far, I've got this vibe from it. The centering of racism on the power, power being at the core, the defining factor and fact of racism. And actually in his book, James Baldwin, I think, James Baldwin's book, At the Far Next Time, I think he actually spoke to an interaction that he had with the Nation of Islam, where he felt as if what they were doing, the approach they were taking to fight Black racism, was by criticizing the hegemonic white god, a singular white god, who Baldwin criticized, because America is not white. America has not been presided over by a white god. America is far more complex than that, Baldwin would say. But what the Nation of Islam were doing were rightfully criticizing it, but unfortunately replacing it with a Black god, which was committing the same sin as America and playing the same game that America has been playing and not working to transcend it. So with racial ways of thinking, for example, the idea that to be racist one must have power, white people have power, and therefore they are racism and Black people aren't. The problem that I've had with that definition is the fact that it just doesn't account for a lot of complexity, like power. What do you mean power? Political power, professional power, spiritual power, the power of well-being and comfort. And like, if that's the case, I want to be able to be racist. I'm Black. Like, I like, give me that privilege, please. And how can I get it? Because I want power. And do we mean Black people in Africa or Black people in Europe or Black people across the world? Are we like scaling it in terms of measuring it in terms of 50-50? Is that when things are equal and everybody can be racist? And how do we know when we've gotten to that point? So I think the power angle is very limited. And I think it limits the complexity of the Black community, ironically, because there's so much to the Black community and so much power flows from the Black community across the world, per se. I know Black is a racialized term, per se, but looking at figures like Douglass and Booker T. Washington in America, or like in Africa, Patrice Lumumba, Nnamdi Azikiwe, such amazing figures who embody a type of power that has helped the enhancement of the African community. Denying a community that, in the name of a political, power-based interpretation of racism, I think, is limiting the community and is harming the visual representation of the community. But then also with privilege, I ask you about that because we hear the term white privilege a lot frequently. And I think there's like a lot of utility to the term. There is such thing in particular situations as white privilege. Here in Ireland, when I'm in class and I'm the only Black guy in the class and people are throwing racial epithets my way, it's partly because I'm Black and no one else is Black. And therefore they have a sort of status-based privilege within that particular space that I don't. In apartheid South Africa, legally speaking, there was a white privilege bestowed upon the white citizens. But to me, there's also multiple manifestations of privilege that we sometimes should not overlook when acknowledging certain forms of privilege. So I want to ask you, how does the theory of racelessness approach the concept of privilege, considering the fact that it's a theory of racelessness, but also how does it define racism?
Yeah, so I define racism as what I said, which is the belief in the category of race. If we think about sort of from the 90s onward, there was this proliferated idea that racism is power plus privilege, right? That was a common thing. And there was even the hand gesture that went with it. More recently, that I think has shifted because of Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, where he defines racism or a racist idea as the belief in the inferiority or superiority of any racial group. So from that definition, the power aspect of it, I think, has been removed, but the practical application or the sort of adaptation of the general public or the masses, one could say, in terms of how they think about racism, I think it is complex because you have people still holding on to this idea of power plus privilege. So as you said, racialized non-white people cannot be racist by that definition. And then you have other people, many racialized white people saying racism is Kendi's version of racism, which is that it's a belief in inferiority or superiority of any race. And they feel like they're experiencing racism in this day and age because of how the public discourse has taken shape. And I'm sort of standing on the fringes, looking at all of this and identifying in a very clear-eyed manner that racism is quite simply the belief in race. Race is the hierarchy that Ibram X. Kendi is speaking to, or that other people who adopt his sort of definition are speaking to. And because race is the hierarchy, it is redundant to say that racism is the belief in the inferiority or superiority of any racial group. Race is the hierarchy. So to my mind, racism, simply put, is just that. It's the belief in race, both in nature or as a social construction. I remove as best as one can the moral implications of that identification, because I recognize that the vast majority of people in the American context and elsewhere are racist by my definition. And I recognize that racism is systemic in the American context in as much as we are obsessed with color, which gets translated as a proxy for race. And in that way, racism is systemic to my mind because it's an ideological persistent upholding of the idea of race for various reasons. And I just don't view it as a good or bad. I think that's also where the Reconstructionist framework falls short, because then we want to put all this morality into it. And I think a person can be racist or have racist ideas by anyone's definition and still be good. I don't think by anyone's definition, I don't think that being racist or having racist ideas automatically equates with being morally corrupt and bad and vicious and evil and all the things that people try to say racialized white people are. And I think that the problem of racism, regardless of how one defines it, is upheld by this assertion that certain racialized groups can't be racist, right? Because as you said, it's this weird sort of matrixy articulation. I saw this one professor from Rutgers University in New Jersey say that white people are vicious, murdering, thieving. They came over, they interrupted Black and brown brilliance, and that probably Black and brown people were doing stuff that, some of us wouldn't approve of, but they were just amazing. It was paradise, basically, by her estimation. And white people came over with their, triflingness and just ruined all of that. And if she could, she would say, oh yeah, we just need to kill off all the white people. But really, since she doesn't advocate for violence, we just have to wait. We being Black and brown people, we just have to wait for white people to stop having their moment. And I'm like, is this a real thing? Like, do people actually believe this? And there are people who believe this and this is how racism camouflages itself as race, as I was saying earlier, which is how I view that it as the same thing. There are people who really cast whiteness as being a metaphor for being racist and all of the sort of moral implications that comes with. And it really does preclude more people from being more clear-eyed about the thing, because something you said earlier, the context was different, but something you said earlier was like, sometimes people will throw up the point that, okay, well, Africans owned slaves, sold slaves, all those things, right? But that doesn't change the fact that Europeans coming in and buying slaves and selling slaves and all that stuff doesn't justify it. But to my mind, because we talk about and think about racism in the ways that we do, I think it precludes us from unlocking both the knowledge of the shared humanity, I'll call it that, the shared humanity, the fact that Africans did own slaves, sold slaves, did things, human sacrifice. I mean, we're talking about things that by most people's standards today, we would be like, okay, that's not a good thing, right? They had their own cultural, religious beliefs and reasoning for doing it, but they are not, Europeans are not so dissimilar from African civilization in that way. It precludes us from knowing that and recognizing, oh, actually, it's just part of the human story to do all of this trifling stuff, if we're being honest with ourselves. But also it precludes us from looking at the very positive representations, as you said, or positive images or positive instances of people who are racialized. I think racialized in any way, because, again, if you're writing whiteness as just being racist and being vile, you're not considering the nuance to that story any more than you're not considering the nuance to the story of people coming from the continent of Africa, or being racialized as Black and being brilliant and beautiful and all the things as well. The nuance is just lacking because we're insisting on a Black and white framing. And that Black and white framing, pun intended, is part of the problem of upholding racism. And then the last thing, the question about privilege. So I view this, it's kind of complicated, but I'm trying to say this in a way that's cogent. I view the creation of race, that racism creates race. And in that crafting of race, as I was describing earlier, from the outset, the race categories were supposed to create and were reflective of certain privileges, certain economic, social, cultural, political standings and statuses in society, in American societies particularly, so that we call it white privilege, but I would take the white out and just say privilege. That was a real thing that was manifested and coded into the racialized language. I think in 2021, it's a misstep or a mistake to take this word privilege and presume that it means the same thing that it meant even just 10 years ago. I don't think it does, because the statistics I was referencing earlier show me that while racism still happens, it's not what people think it is anymore. And it doesn't have the impact that people think it has in the context of the US anymore. Those are things that should be actually celebrated. We shouldn't feel sad about that. We should be celebrating that. And as such, this privilege, I think, is more reflective of a class privilege than it is any other kind of privilege. But we're precluded from seeing that because we're sold on the idea of racism. And in some really weird and paradoxical ways, we have racist ways of viewing even American society, because people conflate Black with poor. It's not true. People conflate Black with criminality. Not true. And then they don't often recognize the paradox of what it is they're asserting about Black people. And for something to be systemically racist now, then all other factors aside, racism has to be the motivating force. And I just don't think that's true anymore. Wilford Riley would be somebody I would point to as having an understanding of systemic racism as I've come to have. But I'll say too, for the viewers, that was a process for me. Even just 6 months ago, I would have said something like, racism is everywhere. It's in everything. I was one of those people, even though I was more clear-eyed than most people, I still saw it everywhere. You see it in my dissertation. I talk about the cultural, social, political, economic violence of institutionalized racism. The book is very different because I learned a lot even since then. And I think, I just think once you have a more expanded knowledge and a more expanded worldview, all of these things get more nuanced, more gray, in the best of ways, but people don't want to adopt it. And then one recommendation for people, James Baldwin, on Being White and Other Lies, an essay you can find online very easily. Baldwin is one of my favorite, at least partial skeptics, if not a full skeptic, eliminativists to teach and talk about. So I love that you brought him into this.
Yes, I think Baldwin has certainly influenced the transformation that has occurred with me in regards to how I perceive race, generally speaking. Again, I came from a stringent Pan-Africanist home, which I really benefited from, which really helped me get through a lot of tough times. And there's such a, I think in an African context, there are so many similarities to how you said people perceive things in a dichotomous way in regards to race in the USA. For instance, I think like we shouldn't completely undermine the dichotomies, because there are elements, they're not absolute truths as they are usually seen, but there are elements of truth within them. For example, in a Pan-Africanist context, the context I grew up in, I saw Africa, of course, as a continent that was beautiful, rich with natural resources, but unfortunately suffered from negative, bad, regressive governance and also poverty. But also I learned about colonialism and how the concept of a nation state was forcibly imposed upon the continent of Africa. And who did it? It was the Western world. And the Western world here is considered the developed world. So in my mind, when I was younger, and I literally have a YouTube video to this effect with my mom, we talk about how the West is gaining and is advancing, whilst its subject, Africa, its colonial subject, is suffering and is regressing with poverty and a lot of different issues. So I dichotomize the world, and there's a deep element of truth in that dichotomy, even today with things such as the tax paid by Francophone countries towards France. However, it is not the absolute truth. And there are so many other elements to be considered in regards, you have to appreciate the negative governance and the other aspects within Africa that point to actual tangible issues that we can address. And in America, I think that dichotomy tends to be drawn. And with Baldwin, I think he beautifully talked about it in The Fire Next Time, in that conversation with Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam, where he talked about how he understands why the Nation of Islam do as they do and think as they do. However, they're deeply flawed because they're trying to replace, in their dichotomous ways of thinking, they're trying to resort to the power dynamics that has been played against the Black community in America and replace the white God with a Black God, which is committing the same sin as I stated previously. I think I've exhausted all of my questions. I honestly, to dissect some of your points, I could go on for years. So there's so much food for thought. I think it's important to note that I definitely have come away with a lot that I'm going to think about deeply, especially in an Irish context. Again, one of the main purposes of this video is because I'm a massive fan of your work, but also to reveal people in Ireland to different ways of thinking and approaching race. For me to be Black and Irish means to be Nigerian, of Nigerian descent, and share particular cultural traits with many people in the Black community, but that should not limit the definition of Blackness. This has been an eye-opening conversation. I think it's important to note, Dr. Mason, that I honestly think, to my point previously about how recent in time the end of segregation and colonialism is, I think in 100 years' time, your voice will be remembered. I think the likes of King and the likes of you, it's going to shine through more so. I think as the world is globalizing, we are bound to appreciate our common humanity. One beautiful thing about Baldwin is how he talked about how if white America looked deeply enough within themselves, they would see Black America. But the reason why they don't see Black American and appreciate their humanity, let's say in the 50s, is because they're not looking within themselves. They're scared to look in the mirror. I think as globalization occurs, as we mix more, as integration occurs across the world more so, we're going to be willing to look in the mirror and see how we're interconnected with one another in a scientific context, considering in an evolutionary context, the fact that we're primates, but also culturally speaking and generally speaking in ways. So thank you so much for your contributions. Would you like to share info about your forthcoming book and where people can find you and your work?
Yes. And if it's okay, Eric, I just want to add one more thing too, because before we met, I was looking at your video on colorblindness. So for anyone out there, I want to make a clear distinction between colorblindness, which is what I think Martin Luther King Jr. was really advocating for, and theory of racelessness, just in case it's unclear. So colorblindness says that, okay, race exists, but there's a way in which we can teach people to see race, but not let it impact how they treat any person, right? Theory of racelessness is more radical because it's saying race doesn't exist. So there's nothing to see. Like you see a person and you see color, but you don't translate that as race because it's false. Any credible geneticist will tell you race doesn't exist, right? So you can see color and not translate it into race at all, which would then preclude you from having racist ideas more often than not. If you don't believe in the reality, the presupposed reality of race, there's nothing to ignore or overlook or transcend. And that, I think, is what we should be aspiring toward, especially for our younger generations who haven't been so far tainted and steeped in racialist ideology. If we don't teach them race when we're trying to talk about racism, teach about racism, then we prevent them from growing up into the adults who then have racist ideas about themselves and other people. And I think that's the difference between trying to address a symptom versus trying to address the root. And then the last thing I'll say, and this is sort of a request, which I could say offline, but I think people might be interested in this. So Frederick Douglass went to Ireland, and he has a special edition of his autobiography, his slave narrative, that Ireland published. I'm like dying to find it and get my hands on it. If you or any of your folks who are in Ireland have this or find a copy of it, I want it so bad. It's really interesting because where the English were not, they weren't against the abolitionist causes in American context, but Ireland was like extra supportive of Douglas's efforts, primarily because of their contentious relationship and history with England. And so they, like, their version of his narrative is life. I need to get my hands on it. And my forthcoming book, it's being published by Palgrave Macmillan. So it is admittedly an academic book. It's in a philosophy series, specifically an Africana and African American philosophy series. And it is the first book in philosophy that's examining philosophies of race, particularly in literary studies. And I show how it has broader implications through the introduction and conclusion primarily, because it does, but essentially in terms of how people in literary studies uphold racism unintentionally, I give a 3-part solution, which results in my signature theory of racelessness for how people can stop reifying racism in the field of literary studies. And a book for the general public, something I'm working on also with my mentor, Jacoby Carter, is tentatively titled Theory of Racelessness, but that's going to be a book for the general public. And we're hoping to get that out in the next year or so, all things willing, because I think you're right that this is timely for this conversation and this different way of thinking, this alternative to be happening. And you can keep up with me by just going to my website, theoryofracelessness.org.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Sheena Mason. I'll also note that Douglas is a huge figure in Ireland, and he partnered with an activist called Daniel O'Connell, who is known as the liberator in Ireland because of the fact that he advocated for specifically Catholic Irish rights, but Irish rights generally speaking, against the crown. So yes, Frederick Douglass is quite revered over here, and I'll look into that and see if I can get back to you. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you so much, everyone, for watching. I'm going to have links to Dr. Mason's website in my bio, and also to her YouTube channel and to other things where you can find her and her work. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.